The 19th chair, Captain Nolan Pierce, drew one red line through the old veteran's name. Then Thomas Mercer looked past him, counted the chairs in the reunion hall, and said 5 words that would stop a 4-star general less than an hour later. "You are missing one." Pierce did not look toward the display. His eyes remained on the registration sheet. "There are 18 verified members, sir." Thomas placed one weathered finger beside the red line. A trace of ink touched his nail. There were 19. Beyond the registration table, brass instruments tested low notes beneath the high ceiling of the Army Heritage Center. Dress shoes crossed polished stone. Retired soldiers embraced beneath banners bearing the silver crest of the 17th Reconnaissance Group. At the front of the ballroom stood 17 polished memorial chairs. Each one held a folded American flag and a silver nameplate. Beside them waited an 18th chair reserved for the evening's guest of honor, retired General Robert Ashford. There was no 19th chair. Thomas Mercer was 84 years old. He wore a brown jacket worn smooth at the elbows, a white shirt, and a dark tie he had knotted twice that morning because his fingers no longer obeyed him on the first attempt. His shoes were old, but carefully polished. He wore no medals, no ribbons, no unit pin. He had traveled 900 miles by train and bus with one small overnight bag and a cloudy plastic sleeve tucked inside his jacket. It was the first reunion he had ever attended. It was also the first reunion held after portions of Operation Grey Lantern had been cleared for public discussion. Thomas had waited 54 years for that change. Captain Pierce tapped the computer screen. No service number connected to this unit. No transfer order. No temporary assignment record. No previous reunion attendance. "I was attached to them," Thomas said. "Under what authority?" "The kind that did not leave copies." Pierce drew a controlled breath. He was 32, precise in uniform and careful with every responsibility assigned to him. 3 months earlier, a man wearing decorations he had not earned had entered another military event with a fabricated service history. Pierce had been instructed to prevent that from happening here. He believed he was protecting the men inside. That belief made his next words easier. "According to every record available to me, Thomas Mercer never served with the 17th. Thomas watched the red line. He did not argue. Silence had protected men before. He knew its value. Pierce mistook that silence for surrender. "You may remain in the public exhibit area while we make one final inquiry," he said. "You may not enter the unit seating section or participate in the roll call." He selected a plain white badge from a tray. The verified badges were dark blue and carried the silver unit crest. Across the white badge, Pierce printed one word: "Visitor." He wrote Thomas Mercer beneath it and offered it across the table. Thomas looked through the open ballroom doors. 17 folded flags. General Ashford's chair. One empty strip of carpet where another place should have been. "I did not come to be seated at the head table," Thomas said. "Then why did you come?" "To answer when my name is called." Pierce's expression hardened by a degree. "Your name is not on the roll. That is the problem." A volunteer shifted uncomfortably beside the registration table. Pierce placed the badge down. "This is the accommodation I can offer." Thomas took it. The plastic felt light in his hand. Still, when he pinned it over his heart, it seemed to pull the entire jacket downward. Pierce turned to greet 2 decorated retirees whose names appeared immediately in the database. Thomas walked instead toward the large black and white photograph mounted beside the ballroom doors. 19 young soldiers stood in 2 uneven rows beneath a canvas unit banner. The photograph had been taken on a training field in 1971. Wind had lifted the corner of the banner. Sun glare had washed out the soldier at the far left until only his shoulders and field cap remained clear. Thomas stopped before the glass. His reflection settled across faces he had last seen without wrinkles. Pierce approached from behind. "Do you recognize someone?" Thomas raised one finger. "Daniel Foster." He moved to the next face. He wrote to his wife every Sunday, even when the mail aircraft did not come. His finger shifted again. Calvin Reed carried peppermint candy because he said Army coffee tasted like boiled canvas. The nearby volunteer stopped arranging badges. Thomas pointed toward a thin young soldier with a radio harness. "Samuel Mason." He counted everyone before he counted himself. Pierce folded his arms. "Some of those details may exist in veterans' publications. They do not." Thomas pointed to a broad-shouldered lieutenant near the center. "Robert Ashford, 24 years old. Left boot turned outward after he injured his ankle during training at Fort Benning. Pierce looked more closely. The boot was turned. General Ashford's biography is public. Not that part. Thomas's finger moved toward the blurred soldier at the far edge. The photographer asked him to step closer. He stayed there because he could see the whole group from that position. Pierce studied the washed-out outline. Who is he? Thomas looked at his own pale reflection over the glass. The man your computer cannot find. For the first time, Pierce hesitated. It lasted less than a second. Knowledge was not proof. Memory was not identification. A practiced fraud could study photographs. A grieving stranger could build a life around someone else's history. Pierce returned to procedure because procedure did not ask him to take a risk. You may enter through the rear doors, he said. Visitor seating is along the back wall. Thomas gave the photograph one final look. Mason's face was still young. That was the cruelty of old photographs. The dead never aged inside them. Only the people looking did. Thomas entered the ballroom. Blue badges filled the central tables. Families leaned over display programs. Retired officers studied maps of places whose names had once been classified. Near a service door, beside a cart of water pitchers, stood 6 gray folding chairs for staff and visitors. Thomas sat in the last one. From 50 feet away, he could see the full unit display. 17 memorial chairs. One place for Ashford. No place for him. A master of ceremonies tested the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's program will conclude with the first public final roll call of the original Gray Lantern team. Applause moved softly through the room. Thomas's hands rested on his knees. His right thumb trembled once. 18 verified names will be read. Thomas looked up. Beside the ballroom entrance, Pierce watched him. Their eyes met. Thomas spoke too quietly for the microphone, but Pierce saw the word form. 19. The house lights dimmed slightly as guests moved to their tables. Thomas reached inside his jacket. His hand closed around faded olive cloth. Samuel Mason had wrapped the field roll in that cloth 54 years earlier. His name had been stitched into one corner with uneven white thread. The final letter leaned lower than the others because Mason had sewn it in darkness. Thomas had not unfolded it in public since the night it was given to him. He did so now. Mason. The letters had faded almost to gray. Thomas stood. He crossed the ballroom at a slow, steady pace. Conversations lowered as the man with the white visitor badge passed through rows of blue. Captain Pierce stepped into the aisle. Sir, I asked you to remain in the visitor section. You are still missing a chair. We have reviewed that. You reviewed a screen. This display was verified by the United States Army Historical Office. Thomas looked toward the stack of unused folding chairs near the wall. Then he walked around Pierce, lifted one, and carried it toward the unit formation. The gray metal legs scraped softly across the carpet. It was not a loud sound. Still, every head in the ballroom turned. Thomas opened the folding chair at the end of the line. It looked plain beside the polished wood and folded flags. That was fitting. He had never needed his place to look important. He laid Mason's handkerchief across the back. Pierce followed him. You cannot alter the memorial display. It is not altered. Thomas rested one hand on the gray chair. It is complete. Pierce reached for the cloth. Thomas caught his wrist. The motion was immediate, controlled, and surprisingly precise. He did not twist. He did not threaten. He merely stopped the younger man's hand before it touched Mason's name. Pierce froze. Thomas released him. Do not touch that cloth. The ballroom had gone silent. Pierce lowered his hand. Why? Because Mason kept this place open for 54 years. Pierce looked at the chair. This is Mason's place? No, Thomas's voice softened. It is the place Mason kept for me. That answer unsettled Pierce more than anger would have. He looked around the room. The master of ceremonies waited near the stage. Retired soldiers watched from their tables. A few guests had raised telephones. Control was leaving the room. Pierce felt it. Remove the chair, he told 2 volunteers. Neither moved. That is an order. One volunteer stepped forward reluctantly. Thomas lifted Mason's cloth before the man touched it. The folding chair was collapsed and carried back to the wall. The empty strip of carpet returned. Pierce faced Thomas. I have treated you with respect. You have now entered a restricted seating area and altered a formal display. Thomas folded the handkerchief once. You gave me a visitor badge and erased my name in front of men I brought home. A murmur passed through the ballroom. Pierce's jaw tightened. You have offered no verifiable evidence. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he removed the cloudy plastic sleeve from inside his jacket. The paper within it had been folded into a narrow strip. The edges were soft with age. Brown stains marked 2 creases. 19 names had been written in pencil beside times, locations, and small radio symbols. Thomas held it with both hands. This is the field roll. Pierce did not reach for it immediately. Where did you obtain that? Samuel Mason gave it to me. When the morning gray lantern ended, several veterans near the front stood. The name of the operation had been printed in the reunion program, but the field roll had never been recovered. The official historical display described it as lost. Pierce leaned closer. Foster, Reed, Briggs, Mason, Ashford. The handwriting was faded but legible. At the bottom, one final entry appeared without a legal name. Shepard. No time had been written beside it. Pierce pointed toward the word. Who is Shepard? Thomas's thumb rested against the plastic. The last man Mason called. There is no rank. No service number. There was not supposed to be. Pierce's doubt returned. This could have been written at any time. Thomas's fingers tightened around the sleeve. Pierce saw the reaction and pressed harder. If this document is authentic, it belongs with the Army Historical Office. You should not be carrying it loose into a reunion. It does not belong to the Army yet. Why not? Because the Army has not finished reading it. Pierce held out his hand. Thomas did not give it to him. Pierce took the sleeve by one corner. The old paper shifted inside with a dry whisper. Careful, Thomas said. Pierce raised it beneath the light. Shepard, he read. Is that supposed to be you? His finger touched the penciled call sign. Thomas no longer heard the ballroom. The hum of the ventilation system became radio static. Warm chandelier light faded beneath rain clouds. The polished floor became dark earth on a mountain ridge. He was 29 again. 19 men had crossed the ridge shortly before midnight. Operation Gray Lantern was supposed to last 6 hours. They were to enter a mountain valley, recover sensitive equipment from a compromised observation site, and leave before daylight. By 2 in the morning, fog had erased the trail. By 3, the radio had failed twice. By 4, Lieutenant Robert Ashford could no longer put weight on his left leg. Mason sat beneath a torn canvas sheet with the field roll balanced on one knee. Rain struck the radio casing like thrown gravel. Every 20 minutes, he called the names. Foster. Present. Reed. Present. Briggs. Present. One by one, voices answered from darkness. Thomas moved between them. He read the slope through the soles of his boots. He watched where rainwater gathered. He felt cold air rising through cracks in the rock. During training, the men had called him Shepard because he always found the soldier who had drifted away from formation. That night, the joke became their only reliable direction. Thomas found a narrow pass hidden behind wet stone and led Ashford through first. Then he went back. He found Reed near a fallen tree. He returned for Briggs, whose radio battery had failed. He guided Foster and 2 others away from a flooded ravine. Each time Thomas reached the pass, Mason made another mark on the roll. Each time Thomas turned back into the fog, Ashford told him not to go alone. Thomas went anyway. No one called it heroism. There was no time for that word. Men were missing. Thomas knew where to look. Near sunrise, 17 men had reached the extraction side of the ridge. Ashford lay beneath a poncho, awake but unable to stand. Mason counted the names again. One voice had not answered. He raised the radio. Shepard. Static filled the valley. Mason waited. Shepard, answer the roll. Rain ran down the radio antenna. Ashford pushed himself onto one elbow. For 11 seconds, there was nothing. Then Thomas's voice came through, weak but clear. Present. Mason lowered his head and smiled. He did not write a time beside the final name. Shepard had not been lost. Shepard had been bringing the last 2 men through the pass. Hours later, military vehicles met them beyond the ridge. A senior intelligence officer carried sealed instructions. The operation would not enter the public unit history. Temporary attachments would be removed. Locations would be changed. Citations would describe a training accident instead of a classified recovery. Thomas's permanent records belonged to another detachment. Adding his legal name to the Gray Lantern roster would connect 2 programs that were not supposed to touch. The officer gave him a choice. His name could remain, and every surviving man could be pulled into an investigation that might expose the mission. or his line could disappear from the official copy. Thomas asked one question. Will their names remain? Yes. Thomas signed. Mason watched him do it. Before they separated, Mason folded the field roll and wrapped it in his olive handkerchief. Keep this, he said. I do not need it. One day you will. The official count will be 18. Mason pushed the cloth into Thomas's hand. The official count will be wrong. Thomas looked at him. Mason's voice softened. If they ever read our names in public, you answer. Do you understand? Thomas said nothing. Mason took his arm. Promise me, Shepard. Thomas looked back toward the men resting beside the vehicles. I promise. The memory released him. Rain became chandelier light. Radio static became the breathing of a silent ballroom. Captain Pierce still held the sleeve. Thomas reached out. Give it back. Something in his voice made Pierce obey. Thomas slid the field roll against his heart. Do not read that name, he said, unless you are ready to finish the roll call. Near the photograph display, Emily Harper had watched the entire exchange. She was 36, a civilian archivist and the granddaughter of Walter Briggs. For 6 months, she had arranged the unit's history into labeled cases and verified timelines. She trusted records. Records were supposed to protect memory from rumor. Yet the handwriting on Thomas's field roll was familiar. Not the names, the shape of the letters. Her grandfather had made the capital B in Briggs with a narrow upper loop. The final stroke always bent downward. Emily had seen it on birthday cards, tool labels, grocery lists, and letters stored in her mother's attic. She moved toward the framed photograph. Its paper backing had loosened at one corner. When she lifted the frame from the wall, something shifted inside. Emily placed it face down on a display table and carefully opened the brittle edge. A yellowed strip of paper slipped free. The message was written in pencil. If Shepard ever comes back, give him his place. Below it were the initials Walter Briggs. Emily read the sentence twice. Then she looked toward Thomas. He stood alone beneath the ballroom lights, wearing a white visitor badge, holding the only surviving field roll of Gray Lantern, while an entire room accepted his absence because a database did not recognize him. Emily photographed the note, the field roll, and the blurred soldier in the unit picture. She sent the images to Colonel James Hale, General Ashford's senior aide. Her message contained one sentence. Thomas Mercer is here, and I believe he is Shepard. Pierce had already made his decision. He returned to the registration table and printed a clean copy of the official roll. 18 names appeared. He drew a second red line through Thomas's handwritten edition. Then he approached with 2 security officers. The ceremony is beginning, he said. You must leave the ballroom. Emily stepped forward. Captain, I found a note behind the original photograph. Send it to the historical office. It was written by Walter Briggs. Miss Harper, this is now a security issue. You have not looked at it. I will review it after the ceremony. That was Pierce's true failure. Not that he trusted the record. That he refused to look when the record began asking to be questioned. Thomas removed the visitor badge from his jacket. He placed it beside the uncapped red pen. The badge made almost no sound. Then he walked toward the main doors without resistance. The security officers followed several steps behind. Neither man touched him. As Thomas entered the hallway, the ballroom lights dimmed. From the opposite entrance, General Robert Ashford arrived to a standing ovation. Thomas stopped beneath the colder hallway lights. The doors closed between them. Inside, Ashford approached the podium. At 78, he still carried the straight-backed presence of command. His hair had turned silver, and a cane rested against the side of the stage, but he did not use it when he stood before his old unit. Captain Pierce handed him the official roll. Ashford placed both hands on the lectern. Tonight, he said, we speak the names of the men who crossed the Gray Lantern Ridge. The ballroom stood. A bell sounded once. Ashford began. Daniel Foster. A voice answered from the audience. Absent, but remembered. Calvin Reed. Absent, but remembered. Walter Briggs. Emily lowered her head. Absent, but remembered. Outside the doors, Thomas heard each name through the wood. He held the field roll against his chest. Ashford continued. Samuel Mason's name was read. Thomas closed his eyes. Absent, but remembered. The final deceased member was called. 17 flags stood beneath the stage lights. Ashford looked down at the remaining line. His own name appeared. He paused, then spoke it. Robert Ashford. Colonel Hale answered from the side of the stage. Present. A quiet warmth moved through the room. Ashford looked to the next line. There was none. The bugler lifted his instrument. Ashford did not give the signal. He looked toward the unit display. 17 memorial chairs. His own chair. An empty strip of carpet. Ashford turned toward Captain Pierce. Where is chair 19? The microphone carried the question to every corner of the ballroom. Pierce stepped closer. General, the official roster contains 18 verified members. Ashford's eyes remained on the empty space. I asked where the chair is. Before Pierce could answer, Colonel Hale crossed the stage with Emily's telephone. Ashford examined the first photograph. Walter Briggs's note. Then the field roll. Then the blurred soldier at the edge of the old unit picture. He enlarged the final entry. Shepard. No time recorded. Ashford's hand settled against the podium. For several seconds, the four-star general disappeared. In his place stood a young lieutenant beneath mountain rain, listening to static and waiting for one man to answer. Where did this come from? Ashford asked. Emily stood in the aisle. Thomas Mercer brought it, sir. Ashford looked up. Thomas Mercer is here? Pierce cleared his throat. A man using that name arrived without documentation. I could not verify his claim, so I removed him from the unit section. Ashford saw the registration sheet. The red line crossed Thomas's name. His expression did not become loud. It became still. You did not remove an unverified visitor, Captain. He lifted the old photograph and pointed toward the washed-out man at its edge. You removed the soldier who brought this unit through the ridge. Pierce's face lost its color. Ashford turned to Colonel Hale. Open the doors. The ballroom doors swung apart. Thomas stood in the hallway beneath white ceiling lights. His jacket was empty where the visitor badge had been. Mason's handkerchief rested in one hand. The field roll rested in the other. Ashford looked at him. The distance between them was no more than 40 feet. It held 54 years. I thought you were dead, Ashford said. Thomas studied the general's face until he found the young lieutenant beneath it. I was never on the list long enough for anyone to report me missing. Ashford lowered his eyes. No accusation could have struck harder. He walked across the ballroom without waiting for his aide. The guests remained standing. When Ashford reached Thomas, he looked at the field roll but did not touch it. Is that Mason's writing? Thomas nodded. Ashford drew one slow breath. He kept calling after the radio failed. He would not stop until every voice answered. Ashford looked toward the missing place. Neither should we. He turned to Pierce. Bring the chair back. Pierce personally retrieved the gray, folding chair from the wall. He carried it to the end of the formation and opened it. No one looked at its plain metal frame with contempt now. Thomas laid Mason's handkerchief across the back. The stitched name faced the room. Ashford returned to the podium with Thomas beside him. He placed the printed roll beneath the red pen. Then he opened the original field list. We will begin again, he said. The bell sounded once more. 17 names were read. 17 times, the room answered, absent, but remembered. Colonel Hale then took the field roll. Lieutenant Robert Ashford. Ashford stood straighter. Present. Hale looked at the final line. His voice slowed. Sergeant First Class Thomas Mercer. Thomas's hand trembled once against the back of the gray chair. Hale continued. Call sign Shepard. The ballroom became perfectly still. Thomas looked at Mason's name stitched into the cloth. He had promised. His voice was quiet, clear, and steady. Present. General Ashford stepped down from the podium. He stopped before Thomas and raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It was not required by regulation inside that room. That was why it mattered. Thomas returned it. Colonel Hale stood at attention. Then the retired officers rose straighter. Families stood beside them. No applause came. Applause would have been too small. The room held its silence until Ashford lowered his hand. Captain Pierce remained beside the registration table. The red pen lay uncapped before him. He picked up the page, tore away the strip carrying Thomas's crossed-out name, and walked toward him. Sergeant Mercer. Thomas turned. Pierce held out the paper. I trusted the record after the record stopped making sense. I was wrong. Thomas studied the young captain. Pierce did not defend himself. He did not mention his orders or the earlier fraud case. He allowed the apology to stand without protection. Thomas accepted the paper. Records matter, Captain. Yes, sir. But they are not memory. Pierce looked toward the original field roll. No, sir. They are a place to begin asking questions. Pierce nodded. Thomas folded the red-lined strip and placed it inside his jacket. He did not take the chair beside General Ashford. He remained beside the plain gray one until the bugler played the final note. After the ceremony, the historical office photographed every mark on Mason's field roll. Walter Briggs's note was placed beside it. The reunion archive was corrected to list all 19 members of the Gray Lantern team. Thomas's photograph was restored. His legal name appeared beneath it. So did the call sign Shepherd. Captain Pierce removed the visitor badge from the registration table. He kept the red pen in his desk, not as a trophy, but as a warning about the difference between authority and certainty. General Ashford asked Thomas to attend the private dinner. Thomas declined. Instead, the two old men sat beside the unit photograph after the ballroom had emptied. They spoke about Foster's letters, Reed's peppermint candy, Briggs and his fear of thunder, Mason calling names into rain. Before Thomas left, Ashford touched the gray folding chair. You should have come sooner. Thomas looked at the 19 young men in the photograph. I came when the roll was finally ready to be read correctly. Ashford nodded. At the door, Thomas stopped. The red line remained folded inside his jacket beside Mason's cloth. A name could disappear from a record. Honor could not.